morning, everybody. It is 7 a.m., which means it is time to begin our first ever virtual Bible Summit. My name is Brady Cook. I'm the preacher at Hillside Church of Christ in Greenville, Texas, and I'm also the founder of a company called Diakonos Church Marketing. And what we do at Diakonos Church Marketing is we help churches of Christ be more intentional in their evangelism. Several months ago, we saw a need within churches of Christ to really step up their online game. We saw websites that had a ton of content, ton of resources that quite frankly were not being seen by people. And so what we do at Diakonos is we not only provide sleek, custom, modern websites that are designed for search engines, but we also help them manage their social media profiles. We help them with their Facebook paid advertisements, their Google paid ads if they want to. We help them manage email lists. It's all about being, as I mentioned before, more intentional in regards to evangelism. And when we started this company 8 months ago, it was purely, as I mentioned, because we saw an opportunity to really help churches. But that opportunity over the last month or so has turned into more of a necessity. Coronavirus has been just running rampant all over the place throughout this entire world for the last 2 months or so, and it's been forcing people to move indoors, people to quarantine themselves, to practice social distancing. It's also forced churches to close their physical doors and make them meet more online or maybe in homes if they're still able to. And so what we wanted to do as we observed this trend happening is we wanted to take some people who were doing these mini virtual Bible studies. A lot of preachers doing these mini virtual Bible studies with their local congregation. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to take people that we saw doing that and help them go into a more organized format with a bunch of other preachers and give them a platform by which they can reach a whole lot of people at one point in time. And so that's what this day is all about. Think of it as one gigantic Bible study, but not just with these preachers. And these preachers are all not only going to be preaching these different lessons, they're also going to be inside the comments as well. And so you can ask questions, you can feel free to make comments, you can do whatever you want to inside the comments within reason, obviously. Keep in mind that we're all Christians here. But I also want you to interact with other Christians. Within this day, Lord willing, we're going to have a lot of Christians from around the world who are going to be watching at the same time as you. And so feel free to engage, to interact, to be with these other Christians, to talk to them, to get to know each other. Because to me, that's half the fun of this day, is not only studying our Bible, but studying our Bible together. So I would encourage you, be active in the comment section. Ask questions, make comments, interact with the speaker. He's going to be there in real time to facilitate questions. There's going to be moderators that will help facilitate questions and facilitate comments. So be active within those comments. As I mentioned, this is going to be a full day affair. And we're going to kick off this morning at 7 a.m. with a preacher named Jacob Hudgins. Jacob preaches currently for the Fairview Park Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas. I first met Jacob about 10 or 15 so years ago when he preached in a town called Grand Saline, Texas, which is not far from Greenville. And when I met him, he was about a year or so away from moving to his second work at Campbell Road Church of Christ in Garland, Texas, where he spent several years working alongside Ricky Jenkins, who has been there for a long time. About 3 or 4 years ago, he moved to Little Rock to work with the Fairview Park Church of Christ and has been doing amazing work there. Jacob is a very diligent student of the Bible. He's a very capable speaker. He's very easy to listen to. But where Jacob excels, and really where a lot of these guys that we're going to be listening to excel is, where Jacob excels is in his ability to take deep, thoughtful, spiritual thoughts and concepts and really boil them down into a simple and practical way and things for us to apply in our everyday life. And so that's what I want you to think about when you listen to him. And not only him, but also everybody else is, how can I take these concepts and apply them on my everyday life? The question that all of them are going to be tackling is, how should a Christian respond to coronavirus? And so this is a very timely, a very applicable series of lessons that you're going to be listening to. But ask yourself, how can I take these concepts and listen to them and apply them in my life on an everyday basis? Do that with Jacob's lesson. Do that with all of these lessons. And I guarantee you will walk away from this day a stronger Christian than you were when you began it. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Jacob for his lesson entitled Wake Up Call.
Good morning. I'm Jacob Hudgins. I preach for the Fairview Park Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's fairviewparkchurch.com. And I'm really excited to be with you this morning and to join in this day full of Bible study about the coronavirus crisis, what we can learn from it, how we can work through it, and what the Bible has to say about it. And to add my part, I'm looking forward to the day, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you. I appreciate you tuning in. I am going to do my best not to touch my face during this recording. That is very hard for me. As soon as I say that, my face starts itching. I've got to mess with something. So if you see me mess up on that, that doesn't mean you should touch your face. That's just my own failing. What I want to do for my time this morning is to talk about how we can take this crisis that we're living through and use it to draw closer to God. So we're going to call this how this event is a wake-up call for us. And it reminds me of a story that Jesus tells about a young man. It's in Luke 15. I'm just going to read it for you. Luke 15, beginning in verse 11. It says, "He said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger.'" So that key phrase in verse 17, "he came to himself," is what I want to focus on. So you and I are living in a strange new world. Our economy is tanking. Unemployment rates are skyrocketing. We can't leave home, or at least we're not supposed to leave home. There is a fearful, deadly virus on the loose. Many people are losing their jobs. Many people are losing their savings. Some people are losing their lives. Sometimes in life, we come to a powerful realization about things in a slow and gradual way. It just sort of dawns on us. But then there are times when life hits us upside the head. And this is a time, in my view, where life has hit us upside the head. Things have changed suddenly, and we have received a wake-up call. And because of that, this is a moment when the iron is hot. Our routines are upended. We're thinking in a different way. In fact, it seems to me we're thinking a lot more about people and about life and about what matters, because this crisis has our attention. So as a Bible teacher, my duty is to get us to think about how we can use this moment to consider our ways and draw closer to God. Especially, I want to caution us against just hoping things are going to return to normal, so that we can go back to the way things have always been. Instead, this is a time that we need to focus on drawing closer to God, coming back to the Father. So in this story, Jesus is talking about a man who has made a huge mistake. He has asked for his inheritance early, he's taken it, and he's wasted it all. And there are 2 things that are really outside his control, or at least partially outside his control, that make this man come to a wake-up call. They're both in verse 14. In verse 14, it says, when he had spent everything. So that's the first one. He is broke. He had left his father's house with a pocket full of money, and now it's all gone. In fact, his older brother is going to say that he devoured his father's living with prostitutes. So he's broke, for one. And then in verse 14, it says, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So not only is he broke, but a lot of the people are broke because there's a famine. Now, a famine is something that's outside his control, and yet the famine is instrumental in getting this young man to come to himself. So he takes a job nobody wants, feeding pigs, and he is so hungry that he wants to eat with the pigs. He desired to fill himself with the pods that the pigs ate. And so then, verse 17, when he came to himself, he says, how many of my father's servants have more than enough to eat? More than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger. The story turns on that moment. His whole life turns on that moment when he realizes he's received a wake-up call. So what I want us to do is just to ask 3 questions about how you and I can take the current situation as a wake-up call for us. Question number 1, where are you right now? This young man was refusing to acknowledge where his circumstances had led him. And it took a wake-up call before he could see what had happened to him. So where is he? Well, he's in the far country, feeding pigs and hungry for their food. And when he comes to himself, that's exactly what he sees. He sees, where am I? Why am I here? In verse 17, he says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger. You can hear him say, well, wait a minute. What am I doing here? My dad's servants have plenty of food. I'm about to die of hunger when my dad feeds his servants better than I'm eating? Do you ever wonder why it took him so long to see where he was, to come to himself? This is just my opinion, but as an observer of human activity, both in myself and in others, this is what I think happened. I just believe there are some things we don't like to acknowledge, even though we know they're true, because if we acknowledge them, it's going to require some work from us. It's going to make us do things that we don't really feel like doing. This really struck home with me when I started thinking about my car. I had a car for a number of years that just didn't work great. Now, I'm not really a car guy. I didn't know enough about it to try to fix it. I could Google it or I could look at it, but we didn't really get anywhere with it. So my car, I would be driving down the road and there would be various lights and alerts that would come on the dashboard. Sometimes the check engine lights would come on. Sometimes it would say it's low on oil, even though I just put oil in it. There was no leak. There's plenty of oil. Sometimes the systems wouldn't work. The air conditioner wouldn't work, especially in the summer, and the heat wouldn't work, especially in the winter, although sometimes they worked in the wrong season, which was not very helpful. So what I would do, my philosophy about my car was, I just want to hope for the best. You know, we take off somewhere, and I don't really want to spend my time and my money and my energy trying to fix the car. I'm just going to say, if I get there, let's just hope we get there. And maybe later, you kick the can down the road. Maybe later, I'll deal with it. I just didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to say, well, where am I with the car? Sometimes you may do that with like an appliance, like the air conditioner or a refrigerator, and you say, I know it shouldn't be making that sound, but maybe if we unplug it and plug it back in, or maybe if we just turn it off, maybe everything will go back to normal. We just don't want to think about it because we don't have the time or the money to deal with it. Sometimes, though, that doesn't happen just with possessions. It happens with relationships, where you might have a relationship, you hear somebody say something, and you think, oh, man, they have a problem. Do I need to deal with them? Do we need to have a conversation? But you don't really want to do it right then. So what do? You say, I'll deal with that later. Yeah, we'll talk about it later. I don't really want to mess with that right now. Sometimes it's our health. You do that with your body, where you realize, that really shouldn't be hurting. I really shouldn't be breathing this hard. I wonder if there's something wrong there. But I don't really want to have to go to the doctor and go through all the scans and all that stuff. Let's just hope for the best. Maybe if I get a good night's sleep, maybe if I wait a week, maybe everything will go back to normal. So you see what happens. We just have this tendency to not want to look at where we really are. And there is a danger in that. Because there comes a point, whether it's the car or the relationship or your body, where the thing demands attention. Suddenly it breaks down and you're not going any farther in that car. Suddenly the AC breaks and it's sweltering months in the summer and you've got to do something about it. Suddenly your health gives way and you're sick and it won't take no for an answer. Suddenly there is no more putting it off. Those are wake-up calls. They say, you need to look at where you are and you need to look at why you're here, how you got here. So the question is, where are you right now? Now you might say we should always be aware of where we are, and surely that's true, but I think there is something that is sort of human about getting into a rut of complacency. And I want you to listen to how God talks to his people. I'm reading here from the book of Haggai. In the book of Haggai, God addresses his people through Haggai. They've come back from captivity, and they've started building their houses while they have not built the temple. And so listen to what he says. Haggai 1 and verse 3, Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them into a bag with holes. I love this passage because I think we can all relate to it a little bit, where you're trying to do the things that you know you need to do, but you don't get what you're seeking. You eat, but you're not satisfied. You try to save money, but it's like it's going into a bag with holes. It's just not working. And God says, think about your life. Consider your ways. Haven't you noticed anything strange happening? That you're not getting what you're needing and wanting? Now, what we tend to do, at least I'll speak for me, is if I get into a position like that, I just assume there's nothing bigger going on here. I just need to work harder. If I can't save money, it's not because the bag has holes, or as God says in another place, I blew it away. Instead, the problem is I just need to work harder. And sometimes we double down instead of seeing what's happening and where we are. Wake up, God says. Consider your ways. Why is nothing working? So, I want you to ask this question in two ways. First of all, where are you physically? Are you suffering hardship, need? Are you out of work? Are you continually behind financially? Or maybe you're at a point right now where you've worked hard to get ahead and now you've been set back by all the market downturns. Are you living in fear? Are you physically unwell? How could this be a wake-up call for you? We need to learn to acknowledge the reality of where we are, and especially this young man needed to realize that he was in the pigsty and that he was there because of his own choices. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who has any kind of physical trouble is there and it's their fault. I am saying that for a wake-up call to work, we have to be honest about where we are and why we're there. But it's not just the physical part. I also want to ask, where are you right now spiritually? Are you close to God? You living in His Word? Do you know His will? You filling your heart with that? You surrounding yourself with people that are going to help you draw closer to God? Are there people that you need to make things right with? Are there issues that you keep putting off and refusing to acknowledge, that if you just go on smiling and you shake hands with everybody and everybody's happy with you, that it might just be okay? Where are you? A wake-up call forces us to say, where am I? Second question. What have you been taking for granted? See, often we reach this point with a wake-up call because we've received blessings that we've stopped acknowledging. We don't remember to thank God for the things that we have. And then when those things are taken away, it hurts us. It upsets us. It unsettles us. And that's what happens with this young man. He's been raised in a nice home by a well-off father. He had all he needed. In fact, it's likely that this situation we're reading about is the first time he had ever been hungry or ever really been in need. It's only when he rebels and leaves home that he comes to see how much he has taken for granted. And so again, I want to read this to you, what he says when he comes to himself. He says, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger." So, he came to himself when he started to think about how many things he had counted on that have now dried up. So what are you taking for granted? I think this is a time when so many things that are not really essential to life, but are pleasant, have been taken away from us, or at least we don't have them at the moment. And so we begin to say, wow, I didn't realize how much I relied on that, counted on that, took that for granted. That's a wake-up call for us. In the book of Amos, God speaks to His people about this. And this is a passage that is challenging for us as Americans because it threatens that sense that we have that we're an exception. And it also threatens that sense that we should always be able to live in some luxury and comfort. Amos 6 and verse 1, "Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria, the notable men of the first of the nations to whom the house of Israel comes. Pass over to Calneh and see, and from there go to Hamath the Great, then go down to Gath of the Philistines. So he says, go look at all these other cities and nations. He says, are you better than these kingdoms? Or is their territory greater than your territory, O you who put far away the day of disaster and bring near the seat of violence? Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David invent for themselves instruments of music, and who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, they shall now be the first of those who go into exile, and the revelry of those who stretch themselves out shall pass away. So he is talking to those who are at ease. You can hear the picture. They stretch themselves out on their couches. They get all this luxurious food brought to them. They have, in our language, a lot of discretionary time and discretionary income. And they are at ease. In fact, he says there is a pride that stems from it. First of all, they think that they're different. We get to live it up, while everybody else, all these other nations, have been taken over, been attacked by other nations. But he says, what makes you think you're different? He says in verse 2, are you better than these kingdoms? And he talks about how because they are so much living in luxury, they're not interested in the fact that the ruin of Joseph is coming, he says in verse 6. So you get the picture that they are taking a lot for granted and assuming that it's their right. Their ease and their luxury is numbing them to a reality. And it is only what God promises, which is a wake-up call, those things taken away, that's going to wake them up to their reality and what they're missing and what they're taking for granted. Jesus tells a story in Luke 12 about another man who had a lot he took for granted. Luke 12 and verse 16, it says, he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So this man, he has an interesting question. He asks himself, what shall I do? I've got so much stuff that it's creating a crisis for me. I got to figure out what I'm going to do now. And so he says, here's what I'll do. I'm not going to give any of it away. Oh no, I'm going to build bigger barns to hold it all. And then I'm going to take my ease. Eat, drink, be merry. So what is this man's assumption? He is taking for granted the idea that he will always have more time, that there's no urgency to right now. The only urgency is, what am I going to do with all this grain? And so he says, I'll just build bigger barns, and then I'll be able to take my ease. Taking for granted, there'll always be tomorrow. There'll always be another day. And God tells him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. That's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call that says you've been taking so much for granted. There is usually something that keeps us from changing in the present. Something about our situation that tells us, no, it's okay. You don't have to worry about this right now. There is something that we're taking for granted that we're counting on. And wake-up calls expose that. So let me ask, what have you been taking for granted? Have you been assuming that you have plenty of time? What if you don't? What matters then? Have you been assuming there will always be money in the bank? What if there's not? What will you do then? Have you been assuming that things will always continue the way they are now, the way you've always known them? Have you been assuming that you would always know what to do, the best way to handle the situation that you're in? If anything, I think this crisis has exposed that none of us has any answers. We don't know exactly what to do. We don't know the best way. We're just doing the best we can. So assuming that we know what to do, that's a crutch we can't sit on anymore. Have you been counting on America? You know, that the fact that we live in this country and we've been blessed in this country, that somehow that means that we're always going to have peace and prosperity and that we're always going to have all the things that we want, luxury, food, freedom. Why is it that we think that different rules apply to America than they do to the rest of the world? Or maybe you've just been assuming, you know what, I can always go home. I know I might need to change my life, but there'll always be more time. There'll always be a chance to make all this right and to fix it all. But I have some things that I want to take care of, I want to do first. What if that's not true? See, wake-up calls grab our attention because they knock out all those crutches that we've been leaning on. And when we lose what we've been taking for granted, what happens then? Where do we go then? Third question. What change have you been fighting? It's funny, as soon as the bottom falls out for the young man in our story, he knows exactly where to go. He has always known where to go. He just didn't want to go yet. At least not bad enough. Back in Luke 15, listen to what happens to this man after he comes to himself. It says, when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. And I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. He knows it's time to go home. He knows where he needs to go back to. But you know, moments like these, acts like these, they're hard. These kinds of changes require us to swallow our pride. And we have to say, I have been wrong. I am sorry. So what we do, and I believe this is universal, is we fight and fight and fight those changes. We don't want to do it until a wake-up call finally humbles us. And so we decide, I need to make the change. Paul talks about this when he describes his experience seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus. I'm going to read here in Acts 26. Acts 26. And I want you to listen carefully to how Paul and Jesus talk to each other as he sees Jesus in this vision. Acts 26, verse 12. In this connection, this is Paul speaking, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Did you catch it? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He asks him, why? What's going on here? What are you thinking? And then he makes a statement that is just so intriguing to me. He says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, the picture here of a goad is a sharp stick or something with a point on the end that would be used to direct an ox as they're plowing. And so you could poke the ox in the back and make them go faster, or you can poke them in the neck if they're starting to turn out of the row. So you keep them directed by using the goad. But sometimes you'd have a really stubborn ox that would kick against the goad. And kicking against the goad is just rebellion and stupidity because it's just going to hurt. If you kick a sharp stick, it's going to hurt you. And so there are stubborn oxen who would kick against the goads. And Jesus says to Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. He says, I'm poking you, I'm pushing you in a certain direction, and you're fighting me, and it's hard for you. I wonder just what that meant. I'm so curious as to how Jesus was interacting with Paul before this moment. I wonder if he is saying that somewhere in Paul's heart there was this feeling of maybe they're right. Maybe I shouldn't be persecuting them. Maybe this whole message about Jesus is true. Or I wonder if there was some other way that Jesus and Paul had some interplay. I don't know that. Here is what I know. Like Paul, we are stubbornly resistant to change. Even when we know we need to do it, we hate it. Because some things are too personal and too difficult and too humiliating. And we say there's no way. And so we kick against the goads and it's hard for us. Until there's a moment when we receive a wake-up call and we decide now is the time. That's what happens with Paul here. Paul sees Jesus, and he decides, you know what? It's time. I've been fighting this change, and I'm not going to fight anymore. In Acts 16, there's another man who's like this, where there's a moment that suddenly exposes the change that he has been resisting. In Acts 16, so what's happening here is that Paul and Silas are in Philippi, and they have been beaten and then thrown in jail. And we don't know it when the story begins, but what happens in the jail will be extremely significant because of the person who is keeping them in the jail. Acts 16 and verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" So, sorry, I had to touch my face there. So, here's what happens with the jailer. As we begin this scene, we don't know what's in the jailer's heart, what he's thinking. But two things happen that really force the hand of the jailer to own the change that he's contemplating and to finally go through with it. The first is an earthquake. And you can see, if you've ever been in an earthquake, how unsettling it would be. I mean, literally unsettling. How upsetting it would be to suddenly have everything start to shake. And it's such an earthquake that the foundations of the prison are shaken, and the doors all fly open, and the prisoners have the opportunity to escape. So it's a pretty significant earthquake to begin with. But then you have the issue of the jailer, whose sole responsibility is to keep the prisoners in prison. And so the jailer thinks that they've all escaped, so he is going to not just lose his job, but lose his life. So he draws his own sword to kill himself so that he doesn't have to be executed. But think about that. If you're in that position where you think you have failed so fully that now you're going to have to kill yourself, and so your life is flashing before your eyes, and you have literally drawn the sword, you are about to do it, when Paul cries out and says, "Hey, we're all here, don't hurt yourself." And suddenly with those two things, it cuts through a lot. And the man finally comes, and what had been probably in the back of his mind before tonight now comes right to the front of his mind. And he comes in and takes Paul and Silas out of the prison, and trembling falls down before them and says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Did you know? I didn't know prior to that moment that man had been thinking about what he needed to do to be saved. But this moment, this wake-up call, brought it to the forefront. So I suspect most of us have had experiences like that. If you've ever had a near-death experience, then you'll relate to what I'm about to say. Sometimes when we think we're about to die, everything that we know we need to do and have not done, need to say and have not said, comes right to the front of our mind. It cuts through a lot, doesn't it? A lot of the things that we focus on in our daily lives, suddenly they go to the background. We're not as interested in those. I've had several experiences like this. I had one where I was in a small plane, and the cabin of the plane began to fill with smoke. And for several minutes, I don't know, it seemed like an hour or two. I'm sure it was only 10 or 15 minutes. We continued to lose oxygen in the cabin. And you can't just roll down a window in a plane. So we really thought we were going to die. And in that moment, I thought of all the things that I needed to change that I had not changed. It was just right there. Had a couple of those in cars that didn't last quite as long. And one time I was extremely sick, but I wasn't really thinking that much about the rest of my life, just because I didn't know if I was going to make it out of that bed. So the point I'm making is that in those moments we have some clarity. We see what really matters, especially if there's something on our conscience. Just like this man, we say, what do I need to do? How do I fix this? That's what wake-up calls do for us. They put the real issues on the table. So, what about this situation that you and I are living in, where suddenly people are suffering and dying, where suddenly we don't have what we need, where suddenly our jobs are lost or at least in jeopardy, where suddenly our lives are turned upside down? What change have you been fighting? What questions are there that you refuse to answer? What life changes do you have that are just too daunting? What do you need to mend in your relationships? What past hurts do you need to let go? What people do you need to make peace with? What sin do you need to confess and get rid of? What do you need help with? What relationships need to end or to transform? I'll say for myself, I have realized in the last couple of weeks that there were some areas where I needed to be a much more serious and engaged father. And I don't know why it took so long and why it took this shaking for me to see it, but I'm thankful I have. And I'll say for myself, this experience has helped me. It has humbled me to see that in my work as a preacher, I have to do more to reach out to people, both in the congregation and outside the congregation here, because people are what matter about our work and our lives. And those things are becoming more and more clear as we suffer through this situation. It's a wake-up call. So what change do you need to make that you've been fighting? I want to remind you of 3 things before we're done here. Remember, first, that major personal change can begin right now. You see, this young man, at the moment that we're describing when he came to himself, he made a change in that moment that changed his whole life. He goes home. Paul, when he sees Jesus on the road, he makes a change in that moment that changes his whole life. The jailer, this night, what must I do to be saved? He makes a change in that moment that changes his whole life. Many disciples of Jesus are where they are because we had moments like these that changed our lives for good. Major change that happened in a moment. It began there and played out for the rest of our lives. I remember I had one conversation several years ago that was at once both the most difficult and the most important conversation of my entire life. It was a wake-up call for me, and it changed me from then on to this day. I have never been the same after that conversation. Now is the moment. This is the time. Major change can begin now. Second, your Father wants you back. I think sometimes when we know we have not been what we should, we always worry. But what about the things that I've done? And we feel guilty for what we've done. And we know that we've wandered and we know that we've been stubborn. And I just want to remind you that your Father wants you back. When Jesus tells this story about this young man who left the Father and squanders his inheritance, Jesus is talking about the journey that tax collectors and sinners were making. People that were now coming to him, he said, are like this young man. They've been lost, but they've come to themselves, and now they're trying to come back home. And I want you to see how Jesus describes the reaction of the Father when those people go home. It's the same way that he describes this prodigal going home. Remember, the prodigal had his little rehearsed speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I don't have any right to be called your son. Just make me a servant. It says, verse 20, Luke 15 and verse 20, and he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. What I love about this story is that the young man has his speech all prepared. I'm going to say this, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm not worthy, just make me a servant. And he doesn't even get to finish the speech. His dad, hush, I don't want to hear that. Instead, he talks to his servants, bring the robe and bring the sandals and bring the ring and kill the calf. Let's have a party. My son is back. That's how God feels about you. That's how God feels about all of us. So there is never a point where God's going to say, I'm no longer interested in my son coming home. Your Father wants you back. Third thing to remember, the iron is only hot for so long. There is urgency in this moment. There are some people in the Bible who have wake-up calls, and they consider something they haven't realized before. They have an opportunity. There's clarity. But they get right up to the cusp of changing, right up to the edge, and then back off. Usually, these people don't have future opportunities. So, for example, there's Balaam, who has his donkey talk to him. If anything would be a wake-up call, it would seem to be that. He also sees an angel in the road, which is why the donkey is talking. You would think an experience like that would change Balaam for good, but it doesn't. Even later in his life, he continues to be in rebellion against God. There's Agrippa, who Paul almost persuades to become a Christian. Almost, but not quite. No indication that Agrippa ever becomes a disciple. There's Felix, who, as Paul is preaching to him, he is alarmed. And he is so scared or concerned, perplexed by what Paul is saying, that he says, you know what, go away for now. And when I have a better time, I'll call you. And he does call him. I mean, they do have other conversations, but it seems to me that none of those conversations have the same urgency of that moment when he gets scared. The iron is hot, but only for so long. How tragic for people to come so close to understanding the change they need to make and then refusing. And then suddenly, they're no longer as interested. Next time, it is easier to ignore it. And then the next time, it's easier and easier and easier. And eventually, we grow cold and hard in our sin and in our rebellion. The iron is only hot for so long. So let me be clear. We're in a time where we're thinking about different things. This time is not going to last forever. Our routines are upended, and there will be a time when those routines go back to routine. People are suffering. People are dying. People are losing their savings and their jobs. And there will be a time when things go back to normal for many. Don't let this time pass without doing what needs to be done to make the changes to be right with God. So making personal change begins with putting God first and getting right with God first. That is, we have to know where we are and own it, and then go home. And we say, like this young man does, I'm sorry. I want to do right. Can you forgive me? Now, biblically speaking, what that means is we put our faith in Jesus for our forgiveness. We admit that we are sinners, we have messed everything up, but that Jesus died to take those sins away. And if we have not done so, we need to be baptized into Christ and have those sins washed away, like Paul did, like the jailer did that same night, having those sins washed away by the blood of Christ. Maybe you've already been baptized, in which case it's time to admit those sins and confess them to God. Get right with God. But please understand, that's not the end of it. Then comes the question, what's going to change now? If I make my life right with God, where do I go going forward? How am I going to get out of the mess that I'm in? What needs to change? Who do I need to treat differently? What do I need to make changes in my life, and who do I need to involve so that I become the person God calls me to be? And I just want to tell you that you can become a different person, that God changes us from the inside out into a better man or woman, that we can get the strength that we need from Him to handle this time in our lives, no matter what's going on physically, and any time in our lives, that we can have peace in knowing the God who controls everything, and that we can learn how to have better relationships through Him by following His example. We can overcome our desire to please people or our desire to control and dominate people. Whatever it is that your struggle is, Jesus can change you. You can know real love and grow to love others in a real way. You can change. Use this moment. It is a wake-up call. Don't let it pass. Thank you so much for taking the time to think about these things and study the Bible with me. May God bless you.
Introducing Why, an all-new workbook by Donnie Rader, published by One Stone Press. Why is a collection of 16 lessons that answer the questions to selected Bible topics. From baptism to faith-only doctrine to instrumental music and fellowship halls, Rader removes the obstacles in understanding these topics in an attempt to bring you closer to God and following His will. The underlying theme in each lesson, and the answer to the question of why, is because it makes a difference what one believes, how one lives, and how we should view the Bible as our objective standard. The workbook has a coated matte finish, making it durable, and it's the perfect size for your case or simply carrying it alongside your Bible. Side margins throughout the book make it easy to add your own comments and notes next to any portion of the lesson. In addition to the printed workbook, One Stone Press offers Why as a downloadable PDF file for both personal and congregational use. Now you can carry the workbook with you anywhere on your smartphone, tablet, or laptop. With a congregational license, you can even print, photocopy, and distribute lessons to members as needed. If you're a teacher, you're going to love the available PDF answer key, complete with passage references to help you facilitate discussion in your classroom. Additionally, you can download customizable PowerPoint slides for each lesson, professionally designed and pre-populated with content suited for each lesson in the book. Now you can have the captivating aid of PowerPoint, yet spend more time studying and less time designing. Why is available now for download or purchase at One Stone Biblical Resources at onestone.com. Order now.